Shalom, this is Rabbi Klein from the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. I think this week's Parshas, Tazria-Metzora, are some of the hardest parshiot and most inaccessible parshas for most Jews to understand, especially contemporary Jews. It deals with the diagnosis of some form of disease and the various purifications that a person that is diagnosed with this disease needs to go through. And the name of this disease is called Tzarat, and the person that has it is called a Metzora. Very often it's mistranslated as leprosy, but it's really not, and we don't know what this skin disease really is. I'd like to unpack some of the ideas in the Parsha in a way that I think will give us some insight. And I also want to share a program that our Mishkan Miami, our Jewish Federation Spiritual Care Program runs that might help you in some areas. In truth, it's difficult to speak about this disease or whether it's even a disease at all or a spiritual condition. First of all, the disease can not only impact the human body, but also clothing and houses, which we're not going to talk about today, but that tells you something that this is not your normal disease. Second, the signs can be there in such a way that any person could diagnose it and say this person has the disease, yet the person is not quarantined until the priest comes and says this. If it was simply medical, then we wouldn't need the priest to diagnose the condition. Third, strangely, if the person is covered with this disease, this skin lesions, the person is pure and doesn't need to quarantine. But if it's partial, if a person's partially covered with these things, they need to quarantine. And finally, when the person actually is quarantined, after the Kohen says you need to go into quarantine, a person has to wear sackcloth, has to scream impure, has to cover their lip, all kinds of strange rituals. If this is just making sure that you're not contagious, why do you need to do all these things? To answer this question, what I'd like to do is focus a little bit on a theme which is about tahara and tuma, purity and impurity, because I think that's going to, this idea, which many people don't understand, will uncover the ideas behind this parsha. First of all, God, ultimately the Torah values life. Who is God? God is the creator. God creates ultimate vitality in this world. In the book of Genesis, God says, let there be, let there be, let there be. God is ultimately the life-giving source. And so purity is associated with God's light or God's life. The opposite is death. To various degrees, impurity in Jewish thought is associated with death and disintegration. Now, this is not a moral statement, although in certain biblical texts it does have a moral connotation. But rather, this is just a statement of reality that we live in. We live in a physical world that is in between two poles of life and death. The idea of purity and impurity had to do with the temple in Jerusalem. That was the abode of God, in a sense. And in some places, in some sense, that abode of God, the temple, represented the original utopia, the Garden of Eden, where there was no death. It represents eternal life and vitality, and therefore, there can't be any impurity in the temple because impurity represents death. So similarly, human beings are considered in the book of Genesis. We are all created in the image of God, and that's a literal idea. In some ways, we are godlike. And so therefore, in a very real sense, the whole notion of mortality challenges this notion that we are godlike. Because despite all of our best efforts, we are stuck in this dialectic between the angels and between the beasts of the field, between life and death. And the highest level of ritual impurity in Jewish thought is a corpse. And again, this is not a moral statement. This is just the tragedy, in the sense, of the world in which we live. So tsaras, or any illness, is a gateway to understand illness in a spiritual way. Let's look at the signs, the diagnosis, and the behavior of a person who has tsarat. First of all, what are the main signs? Various lesions on the skin. But what's interesting is they're almost all white. Now, first of all, the diagnosis is a skin disease. What is the skin? The skin is the protective layer on our body, which gives our bodies integrity. When a person unfortunately passes away, that integrity begins to disintegrate. What is skin? Skin that is flush red has blood going through it. White is skin that is flush of blood. And who is flushed of blood? A person that has died. The rabbis call somebody who had tzarat, a metzora, like someone who is dead. Perhaps the issue of tzarat is the reflection of the fragility of life. Illness, in a real sense, is an attack on our integrity of our body, to the point that all of us are reminded that we are all projected in some way unto death, which is not an easy thing to think about. In our society, we sometimes want to shield ourselves, but maybe this is an important thing to consider. Now, why the Kohen diagnosing this disease? Because the Kohen is in service to God in the temple. He is responsible for bringing God's blessings into the world. As we mentioned, the temple is the place of life, of God, and so the Kohen also represents life. The Kohen cannot, therefore, make himself impure with contact with the dead body, except for very specific situations. Thus, the Kohen, by proclaiming the person tameh, is not giving a medical diagnosis. Anyone can do that, but he's giving a spiritual diagnosis. Is declaring that this event is significant for all of us to consider. It is declaring that in some way, impurity is in the camp. And finally, what does the person that had Tazria-Metzora do? He goes into quarantine, but that includes a performance, an actual obligation on the Metzora to do something, not just to go away, but he has to proclaim to others, Tameh, Tameh, I am impure, I am impure. He must wear sackcloth. He must not cut his hair. He has to cover his upper lip. What is he doing? He's doing some form of performance, but what kind of performance is important? What kind of performances are those? Those are mourning rituals in the ancient period. But who is he mourning for? He's mourning for himself. He recognizes the tragedy of being human. In our society, we tend to want to avoid this at all costs. We don't want to talk about decline. We don't want to talk about death. Everything is good. The Torah, though, therefore, brings this drama of life and death in this week's Parashat to the center of consciousness. We always live at this divide. So what are these values that we are supposed to learn? Because I think they're very relevant for us today. First of all, we have to realize we are all vulnerable creatures. And when we ourselves feel vulnerable, we are more able to experience the vulnerability of others. We need to have more compassion, and that compassion can arise from our own feelings that we are all limited. But second, all of us are in a battle with Tuma, a battle with death. We proclaim this statement in the Parsha, Tameh, Tameh, this is impure, this is impure. In other words, death consciousness is a very important Jewish value. This means that our doctors and medical professionals, modern day priests, are trying to maximize life and are involved in a holy war against impurity and death. However, each of us are also in a battle, and we need to maximize our life, maximize our vitality at all stages, whatever our age. Each of us are in a battle maximizing life, but we cannot do that if we deny our own mortality. The more that we recognize that, the more we can navigate our lives in accordance with life-affirming values. We created a program for Mishkan Miami, our spiritual care program, called Sacred Jewish Conversations, where you can learn about advanced planning to make the most of each day to maximize life every day of our lives. We will provide support, and we also provide an annual training if you're interested, and you can go to our website on jewishmiami.org, Sacred Jewish Conversation. We do not need to scream Tameh Tameh to our friends and neighbors, but we do want them to know that we are indeed finite creatures, and we want them to know what our wishes are. When we do this, we are actually maximizing the quality of our lives, living each day powerfully and with the most vitality that we can have. Wishing all of you a very Shabbat Shalom.